It is a controversial topic, so I'm asking you. A lot of people tend to just blank out. Be patient with me. I'll try to keep it under 20 minutes. And I promise to finish with hope. So yeah, being human, we all started as children. So my heart is also with children. I work with children in my practice as well. So I wanted to start with children and kind of think about it from a different perspective. It's very easy to be clinical. I sometimes use it as a coping skill. But when you put yourself in the shoes of some of my clients and you imagine yourself as a parent, as a grandparent, as an uncle, as an aunt, I'm sure police officers deal with this all the time, and I'm sure you can relate to some of these things I'll be saying. But I want you to think about this. You suddenly are playing with this child, whether your child, your grandchild, your niece, your nephew, and suddenly they say or do something that makes your heart sink and makes you want to throw up. And you realize the terms they are describing something that there's no way they know what this is and they should not know what this is. And they identify the person that did that with them. And you're going, oh no, this is not one of these shows on TV. This is real life. What do I do now? Panic. Lots of different reactions, lots of panic. Making it very human, making it close to home, which a lot of my clients go through. So I wanted to do the backdrop of that, not just numbers, because a lot of times when I go to the numbers, we blank out and think, what, that many? If you would click to the next one, please. The backdrop, there are about 4 million child abuse reports, representing about 7 million children. Those are not even the most up-to-date. That was from my dissertation a couple years ago. That was an increase of 20% in 1 year. Again, I will end with hope, so don't despair, don't blank out on me. One of the scariest and most difficult thing, and I'm sure what these police officers or their peers are dealing with, is that most of these cases do not receive a full investigation. About 20% do. That leaves 80% out in the cold. They get diverted. Some of that diversion is therapy, which I'm a very strong advocate of when everybody wants to be in therapy. I don't believe in forced counseling. If you have an adult rape victim, I don't think they'd want to be in the same room with their perpetrator. So when I have a child victim that does not want to be in the same room with their perpetrator, I empathize with them. I don't always have success with the judge understanding that. Judges can blank out too. We often will blank out when some of these things are so atrocious that we can't imagine. Could somebody do that to a child, especially their own child? So sadly, 80% do not get a full investigation. It's almost understandable because these things happen in secret. So how do you find evidence to definitely prosecute somebody? Very, very difficult. And the children that had unsubstantiated, that's what they call the ones that don't have enough proof, cases, they have very similar outcomes to the children that have substantiated. So good clue that there's not many false reports. It's actually a crime to make a false report. The other sad statistic, and again I won't dwell on it too long, but I want to give you the backdrop, is that there are a lot of child fatalities. 75% of them, they're 3 years old and younger. So again, want to pull at your heartstrings on purpose, because part of being human is becoming an advocate, which obviously I am. 41% increase between the years of 1998 and 2010. That's 12 years. The next 4 years, another 5.7% increase in child fatalities. There were changes in measurements, so some of the numbers are questionable, but they're pretty much still thinking it's increasing. Really sad and shocking statistic when I learned this is that most of the child abuse is perpetrated by a parent, above 80%. Very, very shocking, very, very sad. And the fatality is even worse. It's usually by one or both parents. The most severe, as I'm sure you can guess, is the child sexual abuse that has the most traumatic results in children, especially when the most common perpetrator is a parent, because that's the person that was supposed to protect them. And to have the opposite, have them be their offender, is very counterintuitive, and it just goes against every instinct. So that does have the highest consequences. So going on to trying to detach and using my coping skill of intellectualizing, when it gets overwhelming for me too, I go to the numbers. And so they've done all different kinds of studies, and some of the most recent ones show that there's a huge financial cost. Whatever your political leanings, doesn't matter, we're all human. And big important thing is when we can put things into numbers, we can often get politicians or legislatures to listen to us and agree to fund things. We don't knock DCFS or police officers. They are underpaid, underfunded. So it has more to do with what we're supporting, what we're not supporting, what we're advocating for, what we're not advocating for. But these numbers are huge, huge numbers. They should be enough to get some political attention. The psychological cost to the children, that's where I have to not check out, and hopefully you won't as well. A lot of children they'll go through developmental things. If you think about yourself, the majority of children under 6 are victims. So imagine how vulnerable they are. So yeah, they're not going to be learning, they're not going to be developing, they're going to be sitting in their little preschool, or they're going to be stressing out about who they're going to see or what's going to happen when they get home. When you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, basic, most important one is safety. If we don't have safety, we have nothing. So that's where they're at. The person that's supposed to protect them is more than likely their offender, and they are not safe. And again, because it's so atrocious, it's really hard to believe. So if they were to report, which the majority don't, they would often not be believed. So yeah, not surprising, they often have lower IQ, at least in the beginning. They can catch up. Flashbacks, nightmares, a lot of the PTSD symptoms that you've probably heard about veterans. In fact, they did one study where the cortisol level of children that were abused was as high as war veterans. And the theory is that they have to be hyper-vigilant. Again, think about little kids sitting in school thinking all day, oh, I'm going home, what's going to happen? They're vigilant. They're listening to everything, every noise. And so that's not surprising. They have dissociation. That's one of the survival mechanisms. If you're in a situation where, whether you're in a war, whether you're a child victim, whatever situation you're in, survival, instinct. So one of the methods you survive is, if you can't get away, you just dissociate. It's kind of like the animals freeze. If there's nothing else you can do, you survive. So surviving, just like an adult rape victim, you do what's honorable, what works. Doesn't matter, you survived, it's honorable. They have, survivors often have trust and relationship issues, surprise, surprise. They have a higher risk of psychosis, suicide, different lifestyles that are associated with higher risk, different diseases. About 70% increase in anxiety and depression, again, not surprising. Substance abuse, that's, I think, kind of related to the dissociation. We have to numb out sometimes when things are too atrocious, and we do them, and then often we have another problem developed. Low self-esteem, obviously, because children will take credit for things that are not theirs. They think, oh, I must have been a good little girl or a bad little girl, depending on what happened. And has nothing to do with that. But it's very difficult for them when they're in that stage not to take responsibility. Risky behaviors, interesting statistic that with runaway sex trafficking, 90-some% of them were sexually abused by a family member. Wonder if there's a correlation there. Over 90%. Increased medical visits, more on welfare, criminal delinquent behavior. If you're not being helped and you're basically left out to lunch, I'd be kind of mad too. Not that I'm justifying it, but it's an outlet. Okay, next one. I'm way behind here. Oh, I didn't want to miss the bottom of that last one. Would you mind flipping back? Are we still on that one? Okay, good. That's where the good news comes in. If any of you have heard about attachment theory, that's very near and dear to my heart. I didn't realize it when I was raising my children, but I was using that. And so attachment theory is basically that you have the concept of when you're raising a child, or you as a child are being raised, if you have your parent there, and when you cry, somebody comes. When you're cold, somebody covers you. When you're hungry, somebody feeds you. You get the message that the world is a safe place. So about 1/3 of child victims have no repercussions. And what they found is if they had another person in their life that had their back, whether the other parent, the biological parent, whatever parent was not the abuser, a step-parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a teacher, a coach, police officer, somebody that had their back. A third of them ended up turning out with no symptoms at all. So again, huge amount of hope there. The scary thing, and the reason I did my study, is that most of the prevention efforts are targeted towards stranger danger. I'm sure you've heard that term. I remember walking into a little preschool and somebody giving a presentation and talking about a stranger, and I went up behind them going, what do they do when it's Uncle Charlie? Because that's harder. A stranger, it's much easier to go, oh, this guy did this to me. When it's Uncle Charlie, and Uncle Charlie's very likable. Most people don't know the profile of a pedophile. When I did my master's, they had us go to 33rd Street, interview a rapist, a murderer, and a pedophile. Guess who was the most likable? So the sad thing is that the majority, again, are a family member. They have the most access, so there's the most chronic and severe abuse is usually by a family member, not by a stranger. It's usually the most invasive and distressing. If you think about it again, somebody who's supposed to be your protector. You don't expect the stranger to be your protector, so it's less traumatizing. The least reported, for multiple reasons. A lot of child abusers or pedophiles know exactly how to silence a child. So there's a lot of manipulation. Think about it, it's an adult versus a child's mind. You know, they're way advanced, a lot more able to manipulate. So it is most invasive, most distressing, least reported because a lot of times it is a loved family member. Again, putting yourself in the position, what if you just heard a disclosure and you're going, oh no, what do I do? You're wanting to protect the child because you're a good person, but you might also really like the perpetrator and you're like, I don't want them to go to jail, so you're in a catch-22, what do you do? So that's some of the dilemmas some of my families face, so it's very, very difficult. And again, big reasons why things are not reported. They've done studies with adult victims, that survivors, that report that they did not report. So they found out maybe 7.6% report. That's very few people actually ever report it. So how prevalent is this? Huge. They found out that most of the guys in jail for this, about 66% of the non-familial ones get prosecuted, end up in jail. Only a third of the ones that actually, again, remember that 7%? Only a third of those that got reported go into jail. And again, think about how difficult it is to prove something like this that's done in secrecy. So again, it's a huge issue. So interestingly, there's very little research on the pros and cons of, say, the abuser may be a father or stepfather. There's lack of information on the benefits versus the risks. There's very little research on recidivism rate. Recidivism is how often things happen again. And then thinking logically, you're thinking, oh, it's a parent, you know, the kid needs the parent. And again, a lot of times it's the male, so often the breadwinner, not always, obviously, but often. So it puts all kinds of weird dynamics into place. So, on to the next. Oh, so what I did in the study, I pulled all this out, and then I divided it by groups, like the ones that had continued contact with their offender, the ones where the contact stopped right after the abuse, and then the ones that it varied. They went in and out of the home. And logically, I figured the ones that had no contact after the abuse would do the best, the ones that had medium would be medium, and the ones that had continued abuse would do the worst. And it was kind of a surprising result, which, you know, is very humbling. But it gave us more information to research further. I'll give you more details on it in a second. Did it give the result on another page? I may jump ahead and give you the result. So the result, what I found was the ones that had no contact, yes, they fared pretty well. The ones that had continued contact, surprisingly, did better than the ones that had variable contact. So I was like, what? So there were different theories around that, in that I'm sure you've heard of Stockholm Syndrome. If you're stuck and you know you have to be with your abuser, your rapist, or whatever, you accommodate. You mentally somehow survive. So it's amazing what a survival instinct we have. That's one theory. The other theory is from attachment, that, you know, having somebody there as opposed to nobody, even if they're not a very good person or very reliable, very kind, they've got somebody. Focusing on realizing that a parental offender is the most dangerous one. It's not the stranger. We can keep the kids away from the strangers, It's really hard to keep him away from a parental right offender when he's fighting in court. Interestingly, obviously, I'm sure you've all heard of pedophilia, but 88% of the child abuse is by a pedophile. They account for 95% of the victims. I think we know where we need to concentrate. If we can hit that number, we can get the most results the fastest. And again, we talked about how chronic it is when it's apparent, severe. Sadly, in divorce cases, a lot of times the offender gets sole custody or unsupervised visitation. Again, we can't fathom that someone could do this to a child. And they are often the breadwinner. Guess who has the better lawyer? So basically, we have a lot more to learn. We've opened the door to more questions. But with the research question that I found, it was interesting. Might be the Stockholm syndrome that kids survive and adjust. That the group that had the medium contact or in and out did the worst. The ones that had no contact and the ones that had continued contact, they just adjusted somehow. But the instability of going back and forth and having to keep thinking whether they're going to be there or not. So basically the theory is that exposure to the perpetrator, even if it's a family member, is the trauma trigger. To be triggered of the memory every time you see that person and not knowing if you're safe or not. Even if there's now supervision, forcing a child to have supervised contact with their offender. Okay, let's say you were as an adult raped. Do you want supervised visitation with your rapist? Probably not. So again, the irony is, we often excuse it because it's a biological parent in a lot of the cases. So there needs to be a lot of training, a lot of education, and the thing that they saw that 1/3 that did well was the non-offending parent or another family member that had the child's back. So one of our avenues of helping is supporting them, giving them any kind of resources that we can give them to have them be a big impact on the child. And the sooner we figure this out, children have a different way of thinking before their abstract thinking develops. If things happen before the age of 5, they'll often forget. So if we can figure it out by the time they're 5 or 6, when the majority of victims are under 6, we're ahead of the game. We can probably turn this tide eventually. So there's things that we need to advocate for. So full circle, I promised hope at the end. There has been a lot of change. One of the things that I quote, and I can try to remember the guy's name, probably someone will remember it, for evil to succeed, all it takes is for good people to do nothing. So since we're all human, we started as children. I nudge you to be advocates. We've all got to do something. So we can be advocates, and if we don't speak up, and these poor little kids, they're silenced already. If it's so atrocious and we have to zone out and not think about this, imagine what it's like for them. So we need to speak up. So thank you.